Good morning, Buckeye Nation, and welcome back to the 11 Dubcast for Wednesday, August 13th. I'm joined by our lead producer at 11 Warriors, Chase Brown. Chase, how are you doing this week?
Doing great. Yeah, George, how are you doing?
My disappointment is immeasurable, and my day is ruined. Or my day was ruined 2 days ago when the AP poll was released. Because as I talked about with Andy last week on the Tuesday edition of the show a week ago, the coaches poll was kind of setting the table for us to get a number one versus number two matchup in the opener between Texas and Ohio State. It didn't matter which team was ranked in front of the other because we'd get that sorted out in pretty short order thanks to the opener. It just mattered that we got the number one versus number two opener. And I can imagine that Fox shares my disappointment that this can, after trying to brand it as the biggest season opener of all time, we're now number one, number three instead of number one, number two, because the national media that despises Ohio State so much has decided to slight the reigning national champions and anoint James Franklin and the Penn State Nittany Lions at the number two spot ahead of Ohio State. So I am curious, as the more reasonable football professional between the two of us, did you have a more measured reaction to the news, or did you share in my anguish and disgust at what the national media has done to the Buckeyes' reputation at the beginning of the season here?
Yeah, I see it both ways. I think, in my opinion, I view the AP poll as higher than the coaches poll. I don't know if you would share in that assessment. It seems
I
like
think
that's the
most people
one.
do.
Yeah, it seems like that's the one that appears on the scoreboards when you're watching games earlier in the year. Obviously, when the CFP rankings come out, that seems to be when people's opinions shift to that one being of the highest order. But yeah, it definitely is disappointing to see Ohio State come in as the number three team in the AP poll, particularly when you're talking about the season opener potentially being a number one versus number two matchup. But at the same time, I don't necessarily see the matchup losing any significance or losing any anticipation, considering either of these teams could have come into the year ranked number one overall. I don't think that there's really a great gap between Texas and Ohio State. I don't see a great gap between those two teams and Penn State, for that matter. I think Clemson and Dabo Swinney have a great roster this year as well, and you can never count out Kirby Smart and Georgia, who I believe came in as the number five team in the AP poll. So the difference between those five teams is negligible to me entering into the year. But as we're talking about for narrative purposes, I do think that when you talk about a number one versus number two matchup, there's certainly a lot more juice when it comes to that.
Now, I gotta be honest, I was a little bit worried this is kind of how things were going to shake out, not because I'm just so used to the national media slighting Ohio State, but more because when I was writing over the weekend, I wrote, I made the lead of the Weekender about how ESPN has put the championship or bust label on Penn State as of last week. And a big part of that is, considering that Penn State would be the front runner for the championship at the outset of the season. I know personalities, including Heather Dinich, said that they would, for their rankings, anoint Penn State even ahead of Texas as the number one team going into the end of the preseason and approaching week one here. So I thought there was probably an outside shot that a lot of media faces were going to estimate Penn State ahead of Ohio State at this time. And I don't think it's necessarily far-fetched, but you still would have liked to see them, give some grace to the defending national champions and give that number one, number two matchup at the beginning of the year. But do you, at the outset of the season right now, do you agree with the media's estimation that Penn State on paper is a better team than Ohio State at this moment?
I do. Penn State, and we can say this because Penn State's following the formula that Ohio State mastered last season. And unfortunately, I know Ohio State fans don't typically like to acknowledge this, but that was the formula that Michigan used the year before in bringing back almost an entire starting 22 full of veteran players who could contribute and could lead their team to a national championship. And Penn State has that. It's headlined by Drew Aller, it has Nick Singleton, it has Kayshawn Allen, Denis Dennis Sutton. Like guys like that are championship level players. And so there is a part of me, I would say, George, that's been a little bit intrigued that Penn State hasn't appeared as the number one team entering this year, considering they were a college football playoff semifinal team last year. They returned a lot of the same roster. But as we're talking about with the AP poll specifically, there does seem to be, for as much love as there is for Penn State's national championship hopes, there's love for Arch Manning and what he can do with that Texas roster. And there's intrigue about an Ohio State team that went and won it all last year, returning the best player undisputed in college football with Jeremiah Smith. And then you add another piece like Caleb Downs coming back, Sonny Styles, guys like that. So I do think that Penn State has a great roster this season. It's going to be interesting to see if they can come through in the big games. James Franklin has that reputation, big game James. They beat the teams that they're supposed to, but when they face off against the Ohio States and the Oregons and the Notre Dame in the college football playoff semifinal last year, they fall a little bit short. So if it's going to be their year, they're going to have to win those games this season, or at least they're going to have to keep them close so that they can keep their name and their brand in contention for a CFP spot.
And I think to your point, Penn State was only 5 points short of the number one spot in the AP poll. So the gap between Texas and Penn State, at least on a votes basis, was much slimmer than that of Penn State and Ohio State. And they were only 2 first place votes short of at least tying Texas for the number one spot. And 2 of those first place votes actually went to Georgia, who ended up ranked 5th, and Oregon, who ended up ranked 7th. So
if I can interrupt you, George, I don't understand that at all. And I do think that's probably the difference. I don't know exactly how the points work, but I think that might be the difference between Ohio State being the number 2 and the number 3 team. If those votes go to Ohio State rather than Oregon, and you said it was Georgia, right?
Yes.
If Ohio State gets those 2 votes to be the number 1 team, or maybe it's ordered a little bit differently where Ohio State takes a higher standing and whoever voted for those 2 teams to be the number 1 ranked team entering the season, I think that makes a difference. And so to see that was a little bit puzzling. Not only was Ohio State showing up at number 3 a little bit puzzling, but then also those teams getting 2 first place votes. I don't quite understand. I can't quite wrap my head around it. I don't know if you feel the same.
I would think that it should be more concentrated at the beginning of the season in terms of the allocation of the first place votes. I don't think it's far-fetched that Clemson got 4 of them, but I think if you're looking at a situation where it's pretty obvious like who the top 4 or 5 teams are going to be, the first place votes should be pretty firmly concentrated on those first 3 and 4 teams. So to see the stragglers, it would be interesting to see if we got a voting breakdown of which media members or what have you were anointing those teams at the top, so to speak. I've got one more question about the poll that's a bit of a hard pivot to what we talk about, but I do think it's worth mentioning in the conversation around Texas, Penn State, and Ohio State being at the top that last week in the Big Ten football preview that ESPN did, in which they placed Penn State at the top of their power rankings, they did acknowledge that the betting favorite still for winning the Big Ten championship this year is still, in fact, Ohio State, and that they have the shortest odds, and then Penn State comes in just about above them. Ohio State's around plus 200 right now in their futures, and Penn State is plus 225. And those would be the shortest odds, or the longest odds rather, for the favorite to win the title in the conference within the last 15 years. So even as Penn State currently finds itself ahead of Ohio State in the AP poll at this juncture, the betting market would at least seem to indicate that the common person or gambler, what have you, the people beyond the media are at least in estimation that Ohio State is probably still better long-term for this season. So it remains a very contentious, and I don't think there's necessarily a wrong answer at this juncture in terms of which team is better than the other. You can make pretty compelling cases for both. Ohio State just got the short end of the stick with the media in this case. Last question I want to ask you, because we are Ohio State fans, and so we are ever obsessed with that team up north. Michigan at 14 surprises me a little bit. I feel like relative to the season they had last year and the fact that they're presumably going to be starting obviously a highly heralded and coveted prospect in Bryce Underwood at quarterback, barring some last minute development, I'm just surprised to see them estimated that high relative to how much of that went on last season for them out of their favor, other than beating Ohio State and then beating an Alabama team that might have been missing a few of its best players, but so was Michigan in the bowl game. Are you surprised to see Michigan that high in the top 15 of the AP poll at the preseason, or do you think it's a roughly appropriate estimation of where they should be at?
Yeah, I'm not particularly surprised, only because Michigan is one of college football's blue bloods. And I think they are going to get the benefit of the doubt because of that. They have Bryce Underwood coming in as the number one overall prospect in the 2025 class. Obviously, that was one of the big ticket items of when it comes to news for not only Michigan football, but college football at large, because they kind of snatched Bryce Underwood out of LSU's hands. And then they bring in, I believe it's 17 transfers this year. And so to really hit on those transfers gives them a little bit of a high ceiling, but it also could potentially give them a lower floor. You just never really know playing that kind of game to retool and rebuild your roster. But no, I wouldn't say I'm particularly surprised by where they ended up, but time will tell. They're going to be a tested team by the time that Ohio State travels to go face them on November 29th. And obviously that will be what determines the strength of their season, right? We kind of joke about as Ohio State fans, I'm sure Michigan fans do the same, that even if you went 0-11 entering that game, if you win it, it makes your season, right? So maybe not if you end it with a national championship, maybe that kind of heals the wounds, but there is, I think, a lot riding into that game, of course, from the Ohio State perspective. I know that Michigan will be feeling very similarly about it. So where they start the year, it doesn't particularly surprise me, just knowing the strength of their brand and the fact that they play in one of the premier conferences in college football. The SEC has 10 teams in the AP top 25, and you can't tell me that all 10 teams are top 25 teams in the country. They just have to pick from the two strongest conferences, and Michigan is one of the premier brands.
I don't know, man. Diego Pavia has been talking up the SEC all offseason, and apparently Vanderbilt's a title contender now in his estimation.
That's
so
right.
maybe the conference is deeper than any of us anticipate or realize. But as much of a disappointing AP poll as it was for Ohio State fans, thankfully, the first game of the season, they have an opportunity to claim the number one spot right away and pretty firmly shift the conversation in their favor. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. Not getting the number one, number two matchup is obviously a little disappointing, but you're hardly going to shake a stick at a top 5 game here or there, especially this early on in the season. So I'm sure we're all looking forward to it. But Chase, thank you very much for your perspective. And thank you for tuning into the 11 Dubcast. And we will be back tomorrow for our Thursday episode with Garrett Hodge. Take care, folks.